It's funny how a single moment can shatter a man's world. For Richard, that moment arrived on a warm evening, under the glittering chandeliers of a reunion he'd been anticipating for months. He stood there, a king in his own mind, holding court among old friends, a glass of expensive champagne in his hand. He was on top of the world. Then he saw her, Sarah, his ex-wife, the woman he'd discarded like a forgotten toy. With a sneer he uttered the words that would echo his doom. "Look at her, still as broke and useless as ever." The laughter was instant, but it died just as quickly, because in that exact moment a gleaming black Bentley purred to a stop at the curb, and from it a man of immense power stepped out, turning to offer his hand to Sarah, the useless woman who was about to own Richard's entire world. The ballroom of the Grand Oak Ridge Hotel was a symphony of forced smiles and expensive perfume. 10 years. It had been 10 years since this particular class of hopefuls had been unleashed upon the world, and tonight was a night for showcasing the spoils of that decade-long war. Richard Davenport felt the familiar thrum of superiority coursing through his veins. His suit was Italian, his watch was Swiss, and his confidence was entirely self-made, polished to a blinding sheen. He moved through the crowd, not as a guest, but as a proprietor, his voice a smooth baritone that commanded attention. He was regaling a rapt audience of former classmates, a balding accountant and a frazzled-looking marketing manager, with a story about a hostile takeover he'd recently orchestrated. The details were embellished, of course, his role magnified from a mid-level analyst to the Machiavellian mastermind. "It's about seeing the weakness," he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "You find the crack, the tiny imperfection, and you apply pressure until the whole thing shatters." His audience nodded, their eyes wide with a mixture of envy and admiration. This was Richard's element. He thrived on the validation, on the reflection of his success in the eyes of those he'd long considered his lessers. It was then that he saw her, Sarah. She was standing near the entrance, half hidden by a ridiculously large potted fern, as if she were trying to merge with the foliage. She looked exactly the same. That was his first thought, a dismissive, almost disappointed observation. The same simple dark blue dress that probably cost less than his tie. The same way she held her shoulders slightly hunched, as if apologizing for taking up space. Her hair was longer, falling in soft waves around her face, but she still had that look, a quiet, observant stillness that he had once mistaken for weakness. A pang of something unpleasant, something like irritation mixed with a sour memory, curdled in his stomach. Their divorce had been his decision, a strategic move. Sarah, with her gentle spirit and her baffling disinterest in climbing the social and corporate ladder, had become an anchor. He was a rocket, destined for the stratosphere, and she was dead weight. She'd wanted a quiet life, a small house with a garden, maybe a child or two. She painted in her spare time, delicate, intricate watercolors of flowers and landscapes that he'd called a cute hobby. He'd wanted a penthouse, a portfolio that screamed power, and a wife who was a walking, talking asset. A woman who could charm investors and intimidate rivals. Sarah couldn't even bring herself to schmooze at his company Christmas parties. She'd stand in a corner, nursing a single glass of wine, her eyes full of a quiet panic. Useless, he'd called her during their final, brutal argument. He'd thrown the word at her like a stone, watching with grim satisfaction as it struck home, shattering the last of her composure. "You contribute nothing, Sarah. You dream about paint and petals while I'm out here building an empire. You're broke, you're ambitionless, and you're useless to me." He had expected tears, pleading. Instead, she had simply looked at him, her eyes clear of everything but a profound, aching sadness. She'd packed a single suitcase that night and left, taking nothing but the paintings he'd always despised. The divorce was quick, quiet, and on his terms. He'd made sure she got next to nothing, a final definitive stamp of his dominance. Now, seeing her here, it was like a ghost from a past he'd successfully buried had decided to make an unwelcome appearance. He felt a sneer curl his lip. He excused himself from his admirers and began to move towards her, a predator sensing an easy kill. He wanted to see the flicker of fear in her eyes when he approached. He wanted to remind her of what she'd lost, of the world she'd been cast out from. As he got closer, he could see more details. There were faint lines around her eyes he didn't recognize, but they weren't lines of stress. They were laugh lines, and her posture, which he'd initially seen as timid, now looked more like calm. A deep, unshakable calm. It unnerved him. She was holding a glass of sparkling water, not champagne, and she was watching the reunion unfold with a detached sort of amusement, like a naturalist observing a particularly gaudy species of bird. A few of his old fraternity brothers, now paunchy and loud, intercepted him. "Richie boy, there he is, man of the hour!" One of them, Mark, bellowed, clapping him hard on the back. Richard's focus remained on Sarah. "Would you look at that?" he said, his voice dripping with contempt, nodding in her direction. The ghost of Christmas past. Mark followed his gaze. "Whoa, is that Sarah? Haven't seen her since you kicked her to the curb, man." He chuckled, oblivious to the venom in Richard's tone. "She looks exactly the same." Richard mused aloud, the words a judgment. "I bet she's still waitressing or something, pouring her heart into those pathetic little paintings that nobody buys." He took a deliberate sip of his champagne. He felt the eyes of the group on him, and he knew this was his stage. He needed to reassert the narrative, the one where he was the victor and she was the vanquished. "Seriously, I did her a favor," he continued, his voice rising slightly, projecting for effect. "She was holding me back. All that sensitive artist nonsense. You can't build a life on watercolors and wishful thinking." He laughed, a short, sharp bark. "I heard she moved back in with her parents for a while. Can you imagine, 35 years old and living in her childhood bedroom?" He was on a roll now, the cruelty a heady rush. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was just loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I'm telling you, the woman is broke and useless. Always was, always will be." A ripple of sycophantic laughter went through the small group. They were his hyenas, and he was their lion. He felt a surge of power, a reaffirmation of his choices. He had cut out the weakness, and he had soared. She had been left behind, a footnote in his epic story. He was about to add another line, something even more cutting, when the hushed murmur of the crowd near the entrance shifted in tone. It went from a general babble to a focused collective gasp. He turned, annoyed at the interruption, and that's when his perfectly constructed world began to tilt on its axis. A man was walking in, a man who didn't belong with this assembly of middle management strivers. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with a mane of silver hair and a suit that was clearly bespoke, fitting him with an effortless elegance that made Richard's expensive Italian brand look like a cheap knockoff. The man exuded an aura of quiet, formidable power. It wasn't just wealth, it was legacy, an old-world confidence that couldn't be bought. Richard recognized him instantly from the covers of Forbes and Fortune. Alistair Vance, the billionaire industrialist, a titan of industry, a recluse who rarely made public appearances. What on earth was he doing here? But it wasn't Vance's presence alone that sent a jolt of ice through Richard's veins. It was what happened next. Vance paused at the entrance, his sharp eyes scanning the room, and then he smiled, a genuine, warm smile, and he walked with unerring purpose, directly towards the potted fern, directly towards Sarah. Richard watched, his own mocking smile frozen on his face, as Alistair Vance reached Sarah, took her hand gently in his, and raised it to his lips. "My apologies for being late, my dear." Vance's voice, though quiet, carried across the suddenly silent room. "The traffic was simply dreadful," Sarah's response was a soft murmur that Richard couldn't hear, but he saw the way she looked at Vance. The quiet calm he'd observed earlier was still there, but now it was infused with a soft, radiant affection. The world seemed to shrink, the ballroom and its 100 guests fading into an insignificant blur, leaving only this impossible tableau: his broke and useless ex-wife standing hand in hand with one of the most powerful men in the world. And then, the final, heart-stopping blow. Vance gestured back towards the grand entrance. "Shall we? I believe our ride is here." Through the towering glass doors, Richard saw it. It wasn't a taxi or an Uber. It was a car that was the very definition of wealth and power, a machine of impossible beauty and engineering. A long, impossibly sleek black Bentley Mulsanne, its engine purring with a sound like contented thunder. A liveried driver held the door open. The moment was surreal, cinematic. It was a scene from a movie, a fantasy, and it was happening to Sarah. His words, spoken with such casual cruelty only moments before, came rushing back to him, each one a shard of glass in his throat. Broke and useless. The laughter of his friends died in their throats, replaced by stunned, open-mouthed silence. Their eyes darted from the Bentley to Vance to Sarah, and finally, to him. He was no longer the lion, he was the fool, the punchline to a joke he had written himself. And as Sarah turned, her gaze met his across the room. There was no triumph in her eyes, no malice, no "I told you so." There was only a quiet, sad pity. And that was the most devastating blow of all. Richard stood paralyzed, the Swiss watch on his wrist suddenly feeling like a cheap trinket, its ticking a mocking countdown to his humiliation. The champagne in his glass had lost its fizz. The entire room, which minutes ago had been his kingdom, now felt like a courtroom, and he was the one in the dock, convicted without a trial. His mind, usually a sharp, calculating instrument, was a chaotic mess of disbelief and raw, blinding fury. It wasn't possible. This was a trick, a prank. Sarah, his Sarah, the mousy, unambitious woman who cried when he criticized her brushstrokes, could not be connected to Alistair Vance. The universe simply didn't work that way. He replayed the last 5 years in his head, a frantic search for an explanation. After the divorce he'd climbed, just as he'd predicted. He'd secured a coveted VP position at a prestigious investment firm. He lived in a sterile, glass-walled apartment with a panoramic view of the city, a view he'd paid a fortune for, but rarely ever looked at. He dated a succession of women who were all versions of the same archetype: blonde, ambitious, with bodies honed by personal trainers and eyes that assessed his net worth before they ever saw him. They were assets, just like his car and his apartment. They looked good on his arm at functions, laughed at the right jokes, and understood that their relationship was a transaction. He provided a lifestyle. They provided an image. It was clean, simple, and utterly devoid of the messy, unpredictable thing he'd once shared with Sarah. Love. He scoffed at the word now. Love was a liability in the world he inhabited. He'd made sure to keep tabs on Sarah in a casual, detached way. He'd hear snippets from mutual acquaintances, that she was taking art classes at a community college, that she was working part-time at a quiet little bookstore. Each piece of information had been a small, satisfying confirmation of his judgment. She was floundering, just as he'd known she would. She was stuck in a world of low-stakes, low-reward mediocrity. The news that she'd moved back in with her parents had been the cherry on top, a story he'd dined out on for weeks. It was proof that he had been right to cut her loose. He was the winner. But the image of her now, so poised and serene next to a man like Vance, was a direct contradiction to everything he believed. It was a glitch in the matrix of his carefully ordered world. His mind scrambled to create a narrative that made sense. Maybe she was Vance's charity case, his latest philanthropic project, or worse, his mistress. Yes, that had to be it. She'd finally learned to use what little she had, trading her quiet dignity for a ride in a fancy car. The thought brought a sneer back to his lips, a desperate attempt to regain control. It was a flimsy shield, but it was all he had. "Well," he said, forcing a laugh that sounded brittle and hollow even to his own ears. "Looks like little Sarah finally found herself a sugar daddy." He looked around at his friends, expecting them to join in, to help him rebuild the crumbling facade of his superiority. But their faces were blank. Mark, who had been so eager to laugh at Sarah's expense moments ago, was now staring at the departing couple with an expression of pure awe. The others avoided Richard's gaze, suddenly fascinated by their own shoes. The hyenas had scattered. The lion was alone. The silence in the ballroom was deafening. The DJ, sensing the dramatic shift in the atmosphere, had let the music fade out. Everyone was watching him. He could feel their judgment, their pity. He, Richard Davenport, who prided himself on always being 3 steps ahead, had been made a fool of. And by whom? By Sarah, the woman he deemed insignificant. He felt a hot, choking wave of shame rise up his neck. The story he'd told himself for years, the one where he was the protagonist on a hero's journey and she was the collateral damage, was a lie. He hadn't just misjudged her, he had failed to see her at all. He had looked at her and seen only what she lacked from his perspective: ambition, ruthlessness, a hunger for status. He had never once considered her own quiet strength, her resilience, her unwavering sense of self. He remembered things now, things he had deliberately forgotten, the way she would spend hours in a museum, completely lost in a painting, her face illuminated with a joy so pure it had made him uncomfortable, the way she'd cared for him when he'd had a vicious flu, reading to him for hours in a soft, soothing voice, even though he'd been a miserable, demanding patient. The small, thoughtful gifts she'd give him, a rare book she'd found, a framed photo of a place they'd visited, gestures he had dismissed as sentimental nonsense. He had called her world small, but maybe his was the small one. His world was a gilded cage, a relentless, exhausting pursuit of more. More money, more status, more validation. He was constantly running, constantly comparing, constantly afraid of being overtaken. He looked at the faces around him, the strained smiles, the eyes darting around to see who was talking to whom, the desperate air of performance. It was a room full of people running the same race, all of them terrified of falling behind. And Sarah, she had simply stepped off the track. She hadn't tried to compete in his world. She had built her own. He had assumed it was a world of failure, but what if it was a world of peace? What if the useless things she valued, art, kindness, quiet contemplation, were the things that actually mattered? The thought was so alien, so antithetical to his entire existence, that it made him feel dizzy. The ballroom doors swished shut, and the Bentley was gone. The spell was broken. People began to talk again, but the energy in the room had changed. The conversations were now hushed, speculative whispers, all centered around the night's unbelievable drama. And at the center of it all was him. He could hear fragments. Richard's ex-wife? With Alistair Vance. Did you hear what he said about her right before? He had to get out. He couldn't breathe. The air was thick with his own failure. He set his glass down with a hand that was trembling slightly and turned to leave, avoiding the eyes of everyone he passed. As he walked towards the exit, he caught his reflection in one of the large, ornate mirrors that lined the hall. He saw a man in an expensive suit, his face pale and tight with rage and humiliation. He looked successful, he looked powerful. But for the first time in his life, Richard Davenport felt utterly, hopelessly broke. His wealth, his position, his carefully curated image, they were all meaningless. In that moment, he would have traded all of it, every last stock and bond, just to understand the look of quiet pity Sarah had given him before she'd walked away. It was a look that said she knew something he didn't, that she had found a treasure he couldn't even comprehend, let alone afford. He pushed through the doors and into the cool night air, but there was no relief. The image of the Bentley, sleek and silent and powerful, was burned into his mind. It wasn't just a car. It was a symbol of everything he didn't have. Not the money. He had money. It was the grace, the quiet confidence, the freedom. Sarah was free, and he, the self-proclaimed king, was trapped in a prison of his own making, its bars forged from the very ambition that was supposed to be his strength. The man who had everything had nothing at all. The interior of the Bentley was a sanctuary of soft leather and profound silence. The chaotic noise of the reunion faded away the moment the heavy door clicked shut, replaced by the hushed hum of a perfectly engineered engine. For a long moment Sarah simply breathed, her eyes closed. She inhaled the scent of old money and new beginnings, and exhaled the last lingering ghost of Richard Davenport. "Are you all right, my dear?" Alistair Vance's voice was a low, gentle rumble beside her. He wasn't looking at her with pity, but with a quiet, knowing concern. Sarah opened her eyes and turned to him, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. "I am now." She looked out the window at the blurred city lights streaming past. It was strange, seeing them all. It felt like looking at a photograph of a life I never actually lived. "He was there," Alistair stated. It wasn't a question. Sarah nodded, her smile fading slightly. "He was there, in fine form." She didn't need to elaborate. Alistair knew Richard's character, not from personal experience, but through the stories she had reluctantly shared over the past few years. He knew about the casual cruelty, the relentless ambition, the way he could make her feel like she was nothing. Her journey from Richard's discarded wife to the woman sitting in this car had not been a fairy tale. It had been a slow, arduous climb out of a very deep, very dark hole. After she'd left Richard, the crushing weight of his final words, broke and useless, had become her reality. She'd had no money, no job, and her confidence was shattered into a million pieces. She had, as Richard so gleefully told his friends, moved back into her childhood bedroom at her parents' house. It was a humiliation she felt in her bones, a confirmation of everything he had said she was. For the first 6 months, she barely painted. Her hands, which once moved with such fluid grace across the canvas, felt clumsy and foreign. The vibrant colors she had loved now seemed to mock her grey, washed-out existence. She took a job at a local diner, the one she'd worked at in high school. The smell of grease and burnt coffee clung to her clothes and hair, a constant reminder of how far she had fallen. Richard's world of glittering penthouses and hostile takeovers felt like another planet. The turning point hadn't been a grand cinematic moment. It had been a quiet Tuesday afternoon. An elderly man, a regular at the diner named Mr. Henderson, had been watching her sketch on a napkin during a lull. She'd been drawing the way the sunlight hit the salt shaker on his table. "You have a gift, child," he'd said, his voice raspy with age. "Don't let the world grind it out of you." It was a simple sentence, spoken with no agenda, no expectation. But it was the first time in years that someone had seen her, not Richard's failed wife, not the sad woman living with her parents. They'd seen the artist. That night she went home, dug out her old watercolors, and painted until dawn. She painted the salt shaker, the worn-out linoleum floor of the diner, the tired kindness in Mr. Henderson's eyes. She painted not for acclaim or for money, but for herself. She was reclaiming the part of her soul that Richard had tried to extinguish. Slowly she began to rebuild. She enrolled in a community art class, not to get a degree, but to be around people who spoke her language, the language of light and shadow and color. She got a job at a small independent bookstore, a place filled with the quiet magic of stories. It was there, surrounded by the wisdom and adventures of 1,000 different lives, that she began to write her own. She started a small blog, a digital portfolio for her art. She posted pictures of her watercolors, along with short reflective essays about finding beauty in ordinary things. She didn't promote it. She just sent the link to a few friends. She had no expectations. But somehow the whispers of her talent started to travel on the wind of the internet. A local gallery owner saw her work and offered her a small shared exhibition. She sold 2 paintings. It was only a few $100s, but it felt like a fortune. It was money she had earned from her soul. It was through this small exhibition that Alistair Vance had found her. His late wife, Eleanor, had been an avid art collector, with a particular passion for supporting emerging local artists. After her passing, Alistair had established a foundation in her name, continuing her legacy. The foundation's director had stumbled upon Sarah's blog and had been struck by the quiet, emotional power of her work. She'd shown it to Alistair, and he had been instantly captivated. He saw in her paintings what Richard never could. Not just technical skill, but a profound depth of feeling. He saw her resilience, her gentle strength, her ability to find light in the darkest of places. He'd bought a painting, a simple, elegant depiction of a single, rain-drenched peony, its petals bruised but still beautiful. He had requested to meet the artist. Sarah had been terrified, assuming it was a mistake. She'd walked into his towering steel and glass office, expecting a formal, intimidating business magnate. Instead, she'd found a quiet, thoughtful man with sad eyes and a kind smile. He hadn't talked about investments or portfolios. He'd talked about his wife. He'd told Sarah that her painting of the peony reminded him of Elena's courage during her long illness. They had talked for hours, not as a billionaire and a struggling artist, but as 2 people who understood loss and the quiet, persistent search for beauty. That first meeting had blossomed into an unlikely and deeply cherished friendship. Alistair had become her mentor, her champion, and her friend. He never gave her handouts. Instead, he gave her opportunities. He commissioned a series of paintings for the Foundation's headquarters. He introduced her to influential figures in the art world. He encouraged her to open her own studio. He had, piece by piece, helped her build a life that was not just stable, but joyful, a life that was authentically hers. "What was he saying?" Sarah asked now, her voice soft. "Just before we arrived, I saw him talking to a group of his friends. He had that look on his face, the one he gets when he's about to be cruel." Alistair was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "It doesn't matter what he was saying, Sarah," he said finally. "His words have no power over you anymore. They are the ramblings of a ghost." "I know," she said, and she did. But still, a part of her needed to know. She had spent so many years defined by Richard's narrative of her. Seeing him tonight was like coming face to face with the warden of a prison she had long since escaped. Alistair seemed to understand. He reached over and gently patted her hand. He was attempting to convince his audience, and perhaps himself, that you were, what was his charming phrase, broke and useless. Sarah flinched, the words still carrying a faint residual sting. But then a strange thing happened. She started to laugh. It wasn't a bitter, vengeful laugh. It was a genuine, bubbling up from the soul laugh of pure, unadulterated irony. "Broke and useless," she repeated, shaking her head in disbelief. "Oh, Richard, he never changes." She looked at Alistair, her eyes shining in the dim light of the car. The man beside her wasn't her savior. He wasn't a sugar daddy or a knight in shining armor. He was her friend, a friend who had seen her value when she couldn't see it herself. He hadn't given her a new life. He had simply held up a mirror and helped her see the strong, talented woman who had been there all along. The Bentley, the wealth, the status. They were Alistair's world, not hers. She was just a welcome, honored guest within it. Her world was her studio, filled with the scent of turpentine and wet paint, the sunlight streaming through the large windows, the quiet satisfaction of creating something beautiful out of nothing. She wasn't broke. She was richer than Richard could ever imagine, and she was anything but useless. "Thank you, Alistair," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for everything." "Nonsense, my dear," he replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. "I should be thanking you. You brought colour back into my life when it was all grey." He paused, his expression turning more serious. "Now, about tonight. I hope my dramatic entrance wasn't too much. I confess, when my assistant told me that Richard Davenport would be at this event, I couldn't resist a bit of theatre." Sarah's smile widened. "A bit of theatre? Alistair, that was a Broadway production." She squeezed his hand. And it was perfect. For the first time she felt a sense of closure. She hadn't needed to say a word to Richard. Her life, the beautiful, fulfilling, art-filled life she had built for herself, had said it all. The air in the ballroom was thick with unspoken questions. Richard's grand performance had been upstaged, his narrative hijacked by a reality so stunning it defied belief. He had drawn a caricature of Sarah, a pathetic, struggling artist, and the world had responded by presenting a masterpiece. The group of friends that had been his loyal audience only moments before now stood in a loose, awkward circle, their sycophantic laughter having evaporated into nervous silence. They were looking at him, but their thoughts were clearly elsewhere, replaying the impossible scene they had just witnessed. Richard felt a desperate need to regain control, to spin this, to reshape the narrative back in his favour. He straightened his tie, a gesture of defiance against the chaos churning inside him. "Well," he began, his voice a strained imitation of his usual confident drawl, "I suppose even a blind squirrel finds a nut once in a while. Vance probably saw one of her sad little paintings and took pity on her. He was throwing stones at a fortress, and he knew it. The words sounded pathetic, reeking of sour grapes." Mark, ever the follower, tried to latch on. "Yeah, I mean, what does a guy like Vance want with her?" But his voice lacked conviction. The image of Alistair Vance, a man who could buy and sell entire countries, kissing Sarah's hand with such genuine reverence was too powerful to be dismissed so easily. It was in this moment of Richard's desperate flailing that the ballroom doors opened again. A wave of silence washed over the room as every head turned. It wasn't Alistair and Sarah returning. It was a young woman in a sharp, professional blazer, holding a tablet. She scanned the crowd, her expression calm and businesslike. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clear and professional, easily cutting through the quiet hum of the room. "I'm looking for Mr. Richard Davenport." A spotlight of collective attention swung to Richard. He felt a prickle of unease. Who was this woman? He didn't recognize her. "I'm Richard Davenport," he said, stepping forward, his bravado returning slightly. Perhaps it was a business matter, a chance to reassert his importance. The woman walked towards him, her heels clicking purposefully on the polished floor. She stopped a few feet away and looked at him, her gaze neutral, almost clinical. "Mr. Davenport, my name is Amelia Hayes. I'm a junior partner with Vance Industries' legal department." Vance Industries. The name hit the room like a thunderclap. Richard's heart began to hammer against his ribs. "Legal department? What is this about?" Amelia Hayes didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced around the room at the stunned faces of Richard's classmates. It was a deliberate theatrical pause. She was making sure she had everyone's full attention. Mr. Vance was under the impression that this was a private alumni event. However, given the public nature of certain statements made this evening, he felt a more formal clarification was in order. Richard's blood ran cold. "Statements? I don't know what you're talking about." He was lying, and he knew everyone in the room knew it. The memory of his words, broke and useless, screamed in his mind. Amelia raised an eyebrow, a flicker of something that might have been disdain in her eyes. "Mr. Vance has a keen interest in protecting the reputation of his business partners, Mr. Davenport, especially his most valued ones." The phrase hung in the air. Business partners. The room was so quiet you could hear the clink of ice in a forgotten drink across the hall. Amelia continued. her tone remaining cool and professional, but her words were like surgical strikes. "I believe the words you used to describe Miss Sarah Jensen just prior to Mr. Vance's arrival were broke and useless. Is that correct?" Richard was cornered. To deny it would be pointless. A dozen people had heard him. He could only stand there, mute, his face turning a blotchy red. "I thought so," Amelia said, a faint, mirthless smile on her lips. "Mr. Vance asked me to come in and correct the record. You see, Ms. Jensen is not broke. Far from it. In fact, for the past 2 years, she has been the sole proprietor of S.J. Artistry, a design firm that has been on exclusive retainer with Vance Industries." A collective gasp went through the room. Richard felt as if the floor had fallen away beneath him. S.J. Artistry? Sarah had her own firm? "Her pathetic little paintings, as I believe you also called them," Amelia went on, her gaze unwavering, "have become the cornerstone of our new global marketing campaign. Her designs are featured in our luxury hotel chains, our private aviation interiors, and our international print media. Her work has a quiet power, an authenticity that resonates with our clientele. It's been remarkably successful." She tapped her tablet. Last fiscal year, S.J. Artistry's contract with Vance Industries was valued at 7 figures. This year we expect that to double. 7 figures. The number echoed in the cavernous silence of the ballroom. 7 figures. More than Richard made in 3 years of his soul-crushing, high-pressure job. The balding accountant he'd been lecturing earlier looked like he might faint. Amelia wasn't finished. She took a step closer, lowering her voice slightly, though it still seemed to carry to every corner of the room. "And as for Ms. Jensen being useless, Mr. Vance finds her contributions to be anything but. She is not just a contractor, Mr. Davenport. She is one of the most gifted and insightful creative partners he has ever worked with. It was her vision that reshaped the aesthetic of our entire brand. She is also the head of the selection committee for the Elena Vance Art Foundation, a position that gives her stewardship over a $50 million endowment for emerging artists." $50 million. The foundation. Richard remembered Sarah mentioning it, her eyes lighting up as she talked about helping young artists who were struggling like she had. He'd dismissed it as another one of her little charity hobbies. He hadn't understood. He hadn't understood any of it. Amelia Hayes let the information settle, allowing the full weight of Richard's humiliation to crush him. The unveiling was complete. This wasn't just a personal triumph for Sarah, it was a professional annihilation of Richard. He had built his identity on being the successful one, the one with business acumen, the one who could spot value and weakness, and he had been spectacularly, publicly, catastrophically wrong. He hadn't just misjudged his ex-wife, he had failed to recognize a multi-million-dollar talent that was sitting right in front of him. He, the master of the hostile takeover, had been subject to the quietest, most elegant, and most devastating takedown imaginable. Mr. Vance wanted to ensure there were no further misunderstandings, Amelia concluded, her professional mask firmly back in place. He is a very private man, but he is fiercely protective of his people. Have a pleasant evening, Mr. Davenport. With a final, dismissive nod, she turned and walked away, leaving Richard standing in the center of the room, utterly exposed. The whispers started immediately, a tidal wave of gossip and schadenfreude. He was no longer the king of his high school reunion. He was a cautionary tale, a joke, the man who had thrown away a diamond because he was too stupid to realize it wasn't a rock. He looked around at the faces of his classmates, and he saw it. Not envy, not admiration. He saw contempt, and worse, pity, the very same pity he had seen in Sarah's eyes. He finally understood. Her value was never tied to him. Her success wasn't a reaction to him. It had been born in spite of him. She hadn't needed to find a billionaire to save her. She had become a force in her own right. The billionaire had simply been smart enough to recognize it. The moments after Amelia Hayes's departure were a blur of fractured images and muffled sounds for Richard. The ballroom, once a stage for his triumph, had become a coliseum, and he was the defeated gladiator, left to the mercy of the crowd. Their whispers were the jeers, their stares the pointed thumbs down. He felt stripped bare, his armor of arrogance and success ripped away, leaving only the soft, vulnerable flesh of his ego, now riddled with wounds. His so-called friends, the ones who had laughed at his cruel jokes, now treated him like a contagion. Mark physically took a step back, as if proximity to Richard's failure might be catching. Others busied themselves with their phones, suddenly engrossed in non-existent emails, their bodies angled away from him. The circle of his court had dissolved. He was an outcast, a pariah in a world that only respects winners. He had to escape. He turned, his movements stiff and robotic, and walked towards the exit. No one tried to stop him. No one offered a comforting word. The path cleared before him as if he were a leper. The sound of his own footsteps on the marble floor was unnaturally loud, each one a hammer blow to his shattered pride. He pushed through the doors into the lobby, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The cool, conditioned air did nothing to quell the fire of shame burning in his chest. He saw them then, standing near the valet stand. Sarah and Alistair Vance. They weren't leaving. They were waiting. Alistair was speaking quietly to the liveried driver, who was nodding respectfully. Sarah was standing a few feet away, looking at a large, abstract painting on the lobby wall. She was completely absorbed, her head tilted, a familiar look of intense concentration on her face. It was the same look she used to get when studying a flower petal before painting it. She was in her own world, a world of color and form, seemingly oblivious to the social detonation that had just occurred in the ballroom. As if sensing his presence, she turned. Her eyes met his. The pity was still there, but now it was layered with something else. A deep, resonant sadness, not for herself, but for him. Richard's legs carried him forward, propelled by a desperate, self-destructive need for confrontation. He needed to say something, anything, to try and reclaim a shred of his dignity, to prove that he was not the fool everyone now thought he was. "What was that?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. He was addressing Sarah, but his glare was fixed on Alistair Vance. "That whole performance in there, what was it? Some kind of sick revenge plot?" Alistair turned slowly, his expression unreadable. He was a man accustomed to dealing with loud, angry men like Richard. He was utterly unfazed. "Revenge, Mr. Davenport. That would imply that you are significant enough to warrant such an effort." The words were delivered quietly, without heat, but they were more cutting than any shout. "You set me up," Richard accused, his voice rising. "You and her. You planned this whole thing to humiliate me." Sarah finally spoke, her voice as calm and steady as a deep river. "No, Richard, we didn't." She took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "You humiliated yourself. All we did was tell the truth." "The truth?" he scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "The truth is you were nothing when I left you. You were a waitress living with her parents. And now what? You're some kind of art mogul. It's a lie. He's propping you up." He pointed a trembling finger at Alistair. "Do you really believe that?" Sarah asked, and the question was so genuine, so devoid of anger, that it stopped him cold. "After all these years, do you still think so little of me? Do you still see me as so completely incapable?" Her words pierced through his rage, hitting something deeper, something he hadn't acknowledged in years. He remembered their early days, before his ambition had consumed him. He'd been proud of her art then. He'd bragged to his friends about her talent. He'd loved watching her paint, her face smudged with color, her eyes alive with passion. When had that changed? When had he started seeing her passion as a liability instead of a gift? "I saw your potential, Richard," she continued, her voice softening. "I saw the brilliant, driven man you could be, but I also saw the fear that was driving you, the fear of not being enough, of not being the most successful person in the room. That fear is what made you cruel. It's what made you need to belittle me, to keep me small, so you could feel big." Every word was a perfectly aimed arrow, striking at the heart of his deepest insecurities. He had spent his entire life building walls around that fear, reinforcing them with money and status. And now she was dismantling them, brick by brick, with nothing but the quiet truth. "I didn't leave you because I didn't love you," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I left because I was losing myself trying to fit into your world. A world where everything and everyone has a price tag. I couldn't live like that. I had to find a way to be valuable to myself." Valuable to myself. The concept was foreign to him. His value had always been external, measured by his salary, his title, the admiring glances of others. The idea of intrinsic self-worth was a language he didn't speak. Alistair stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder. "I think we're done here," he said, his voice firm. He looked at Richard, and for the first time, Richard saw a flicker of emotion in the billionaire's eyes. It was contempt. "You had a treasure, Mr. Davenport, and you were too blind to see it. You didn't just lose a wife, you lost a fortune. The kind of fortune that can't be quantified on a balance sheet." The driver brought the Bentley around then, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Alistair opened the door for Sarah, and she slid in, giving Richard one last, lingering look. It was a look of finality. A goodbye not to their marriage, which had ended long ago, but to the entire painful chapter of their shared history. As the car pulled away, its red taillights disappearing into the city traffic, Richard was left alone on the sidewalk. The sounds of the reunion, the laughter and music spilled out from the hotel, but they sounded like they were coming from a different world, a world he no longer belonged to. The shattering was complete. It wasn't just his pride or his reputation, it was his entire worldview. The rules he had lived by, the metrics by which he had measured success and failure, had all been proven false. He had spent years chasing a hollow victory, only to find himself alone, empty-handed, and exposed as the one thing he had always feared being, a failure. Not a financial failure, but a human one. And as he stood there, under the unforgiving glare of the hotel's lights, Richard Davenport finally understood the true meaning of the word broke. The drive away from the hotel was silent for a long time. Sarah watched the city lights paint fleeting patterns across Alistair's stoic profile. The adrenaline from the confrontation with Richard was beginning to fade, leaving behind a hollow ache of what-ifs and what-used-to-bes. It wasn't triumph she felt, but a profound and weary sense of release, like a patient finally breathing on their own after a long, suffocating illness. "His face," she murmured more to herself than to Alistair. "He looked so lost." "Some men build their houses on fault lines, my dear," Alistair said, his eyes still on the road. "They mistake the constant trembling for strength. When the earthquake finally comes, they are always surprised." He glanced at her, his expression softening. "You should not waste your sympathy on a man who would have gladly watched you drown just to prove he was the better swimmer." "It's not sympathy, not really," she clarified, struggling to find the right words. "It's a recognition. I saw the scared young man I married tonight, the one who was so desperate to prove himself to a world that he felt was constantly judging him. I thought my love would be enough to heal that part of him. I was wrong." It was a painful admission. For years, she had carried the failure of their marriage as her own. She hadn't been ambitious enough, polished enough, ruthless enough. She had tried to contort herself into the shape he desired, and in doing so had nearly erased herself completely. The Sarah who had left him 5 years ago would have been devastated by his words tonight. She would have absorbed them, believed them, let them reinforce the prison of self-doubt he had built around her. But she wasn't that Sarah anymore. Her work, her friendship with Alistair, and most importantly, her rediscovery of her own inner voice had changed her. She had spent years learning to validate herself, to find her worth not in a man's approval or a bank statement, but in the steady, joyful act of creation. Each brushstroke, each successful project, each young artist she mentored through the foundation was a testament to her value. "You know," she said, a revelation dawning on her. "The cruelest thing he ever did wasn't calling me broke or useless. It was convincing me for a little while that my art was just a silly hobby, that the thing that brought me the most joy was worthless. Because he was threatened by it," Alistair said simply. "Your art comes from a place of authenticity and passion. His world is built on artifice and calculation. He couldn't understand your currency, so he declared it counterfeit." They drove on, the conversation lapsing back into a comfortable silence. Alistair pulled up not to a grand mansion, but to a discreet, elegant brownstone on a quiet, tree-lined street. This was his private residence, a place few people ever saw. Inside, it wasn't a sterile museum of wealth, but a warm, inviting home filled with books and art that he and his late wife had collected over a lifetime. Sarah's peony painting hung in a place of honor over the fireplace. Alistair poured them both a small glass of brandy. He handed one to Sarah and raised his own. "To S.J. Artistry," he said, "and to the remarkable woman who built it." Sarah smiled, the warmth of the brandy mirroring the warmth spreading through her chest. "Alistair, about what your lawyer said, about the 7-figure contract, was that really necessary?" He took a sip, his eyes twinkling over the rim of the glass. "Mr. Davenport strikes me as a man who only understands the language of numbers. I merely wanted to provide him with a translation he could comprehend." He set his glass down. "But that is not why I value you, Sarah, and you know that. The money is a byproduct. The real value is in your vision, your integrity. Those are the qualities Elena admired. They are the qualities I admire." He walked over to a bookshelf and pulled out a worn, leather-bound album. He brought it over and sat beside her on the plush sofa. It was filled with photos of him and his wife, Elena. In every picture, she was radiant, her smile full of life. Many of the photos showed her in art studios, covered in clay or paint, her expression one of pure, unadulterated joy. "She was an artist too," Alistair said softly, tracing a photo of a young, vibrant Elena. "A sculptor. She was brilliant, but she came from a family that didn't approve. They wanted her to marry well and host parties. For a time, she gave up her art to please them. It was the unhappiest I had ever seen her. The light just went out of her eyes." He looked at Sarah, his gaze intense. "I made her a promise that I would never let anyone, including myself, stand in the way of her passion again. I built her a studio, and I watched as she came back to life. Helping you, Sarah, feels like keeping that promise to her. Seeing you flourish, it honors her memory." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. She finally understood the depth of their connection. It wasn't just about business or friendship. It was a shared understanding of what it meant to fight for one's soul, for the part of you that creates and finds joy in beauty. Richard had tried to take that from her. Alistair had given it back. Meanwhile, Richard had driven aimlessly, the city lights a meaningless smear outside his window. He ended up at his apartment, the glass box in the sky that had always felt like the pinnacle of success. Tonight, it felt like a cage, cold, empty, and sterile. The panoramic view of the city he was so proud of offered no comfort. It just looked like a million tiny lights, each one a life he couldn't connect with. He poured himself a whiskey, the expensive single malt tasting like ash in his mouth. He sank onto his designer sofa, the silence of the apartment pressing in on him. For the first time, he was forced to look at himself without the filter of his success, and he didn't like what he saw. Sarah's words echoed in his mind. the fear of not being enough. She had seen right through him. His whole life had been a frantic, desperate race to outrun that fear. He had accumulated wealth, power and status like a shield, but it was a shield made of glass. Tonight, Sarah had shattered it with a single quiet truth. He thought about their marriage. He had rewritten the history to fit his narrative. He was the ambitious one. She was the dead weight. But now, the real memories came flooding back. The laughter, the shared dreams they'd had when they were young and poor, the way she believed in him before he even believed in himself. He had taken her belief, used it as fuel for his own ambition, and then discarded her when he thought he no longer needed it. He had called her useless. The irony was a physical pain. She had built a business based on the very thing he'd despised. She had created value, real, tangible value, from her passion. And he? What had he built? A portfolio? A collection of assets? He hadn't created anything. He just moved money around. He was a parasite feeding off the creations of others. The reckoning was brutal. He had won the race he'd set for himself, but he'd lost everything that mattered along the way. He was rich, successful, and completely, utterly alone. He looked around the vast, empty apartment, and the silence was his answer. This was the empire he had built, an empire of one, and its king was the loneliest man in the world. He dropped his head into his hands, the whiskey glass falling from his numb fingers and shattering on the polished concrete floor. The sound was deafening. The sun rose over the city, casting long shadows and painting the sky in hues of soft pink and orange. Colors that Sarah, for the first time in a long while, didn't feel the immediate urge to capture on paper. She stood on the small balcony of Alistair's brownstone, a mug of coffee warming her hands, watching the world awaken. The night had been a tempest, a churning sea of past and present, but the morning had brought with it a profound, deep-seated calm. The final ghost had been laid to rest. Alistair joined her, handing her a small, elegant box. "A thought," he said simply. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a key. It was ornate, old-fashioned, with the letters EVF intricately carved into its head. "The Elena Vance Foundation," Sarah breathed, looking at him with wide, questioning eyes. "The board had its final vote yesterday afternoon," Alistair explained, leaning against the railing beside her. "They have unanimously approved the proposal to make the head of the selection committee a permanent executive directorship. Full autonomy over the endowment, the programs, everything. It's no longer a position, Sarah. It's an institution. And it's yours, if you want it." It was an offer that would change her life irrevocably. It meant security, prestige, and the power to help hundreds, perhaps thousands of artists. It was the kind of validation that the old Sarah would have wept for. It was a seat at a very powerful table. She looked at the key in her palm. It felt heavy, laden with responsibility and expectation. For a moment she pictured the life it represented. Board meetings, fundraising galas, a world of influence and importance. It was a good world, a world where she could do immense good. But it was still, in its own way, a world of structure, of rules, of other people's expectations. Then she thought of her studio. The glorious, chaotic mess of it, the smell of linseed oil and fresh coffee, the way the dust motes danced in the afternoon light, the sublime, solitary joy of facing a blank canvas, a universe of possibility at her fingertips. That was her church. That was her home. She closed her hand around the key and turned to Alistair, her expression one of immense gratitude and newfound clarity. "Alistair, I am more honored than I can possibly say, and I will gladly continue to head the committee, to pour my heart into finding and nurturing new talent, but I must do so as Sarah Jensen, artist." She saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes, quickly replaced by a deep, knowing respect. "I can't become an institution," she explained, her voice finding a new strength. "My value, my vision, everything you admire in me, it comes from my work. It comes from the studio. If I give that up, I'll lose the very thing that makes me, me. I can't trade my freedom, not even for this. I spent too long fighting to get it back. It was the most important decision of her life, and she had made it without hesitation. She was choosing her own path, not the one offered by Richard's world of corporate success, nor the one offered by Alistair's world of philanthropic prestige. She was choosing her own quiet, colourful, joyful world. Alistair was silent for a long moment. Then he broke into a wide, genuine smile. "That," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "is the answer Elena would have given." He nodded, taking the box back. "The position will remain open, and you will continue to lead it on your own terms. We will build the institution around you, not the other way around." At that same moment, across town, Richard was staring at the shards of his broken whiskey glass on the floor. He hadn't slept. He had spent the night replaying his life, seeing with excruciating clarity the exact moments where he had chosen the path of fear over the path of love. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Mark, the friend who had abandoned him so quickly at the party. "Dude, are you okay? The whole office is talking about it. The story is everywhere." The humiliation was no longer confined to the ballroom. It was out in the world. His carefully constructed image was in ruins. He knew what would happen next. The whispers at work, the loss of respect. In his world, perception was reality, and the perception of him was now that of a fool. A strange sense of calm washed over him. He had hit bottom. There was nowhere to go but up, or sideways, or just somewhere else. For the first time, the relentless drive to climb, to compete, to win, was gone. The engine had run out of fuel. He thought of Sarah. He thought of her quiet strength, her unwavering integrity. He thought about her art. He went to his laptop and with trembling fingers typed SJ Artistry into the search bar. Her website bloomed on his screen. It was beautiful, clean, elegant, and filled with her work. There were the familiar flowers and landscapes from their early days, but they were different now. Bolder, more confident. There were also powerful abstract pieces, swirling with complex emotions. And then there were the designs she'd done for Vance Industries, sleek, sophisticated, and utterly brilliant. He clicked on her About page. There was a photo of her in her studio, smiling, a smudge of blue paint on her cheek. She looked happy, genuinely, radiantly happy. He read her bio. It spoke of her journey, of finding her voice, of the belief that art could bring beauty and meaning to a chaotic world. It didn't mention him. There was no bitterness, no reference to a painful past. It was as if he were an insignificant footnote, already erased. He had spent 5 years believing she was living in his shadow. The truth was, she hadn't been in his shadow at all. She had been standing in her own light the entire time. Richard closed the laptop. The path forward was terrifyingly unclear. He had lost his compass, his map, his entire reason for running the race. But as he looked out at the sunrise, the same sunrise Sarah was watching from her balcony, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a very long time. It wasn't ambition, it wasn't pride. It was a tiny, fragile seed of hope. The hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to find a different path. A path where value wasn't measured in dollars, but in truth. A path where he might one day be able to look in the mirror and not see a failure, but a man who was finally, painfully, beginning to understand. The reckoning had been brutal, but it was also a gift. It was the chance to start again. Sarah left Alistair's home and took a taxi not to her apartment, but to her studio. She unlocked the door, and the familiar, comforting smell washed over her. The morning light was streaming through the large industrial windows, illuminating the beautiful chaos within. Canvases in various stages of completion were propped against the walls. Jars bristling with brushes stood on wooden tables. She walked to the center of the room and looked at the large blank canvas sitting on her main easel. A new day, a new beginning, a new creation. She was not the broke and useless woman from Richard's story. She was not the powerful executive from Alistair's offer. She was a creator, a painter. She was the author of her own life, and today she had a beautiful blank page to fill. She picked up a brush, dipped it in a vibrant sun-yellow paint, and began. So, what would you have done? If you were Sarah, would you have accepted the executive position at the foundation, securing a future of power and influence to do good in the world? Or would you have made the same choice she did, turning it down to protect the very artistic freedom that had saved you? Let us know in the comments below.